Hi class, my name is Corrine Colin and I am your teacher for FSN 310, Maternal and Child Nutrition. This is your first lecture. I'm recording it because I had surgery over the break, so I'm not going to be at your first class. Please watch it. You will have it on your midterm, so you'll definitely want to know the material for your midterm. I will say this lecture is one of the most scientifically complex lectures of the class because we're going to talk a little bit in detail about hormones of fertility and the menstrual cycle. And after we get through that, it becomes a lot less kind of scientifically intense. So bear with us through that few slides. I really enjoyed teaching this class. This is a picture of me and my son. You're going to see him a lot throughout this class. This was taken a few years ago. He's 3 years old now. But I'm a mom. I'm a registered dietitian. I'm a certified nutrition support clinician. I have my certified diabetes educator certificate. I primarily have worked with adults and elderly, but I have my own child, which does not make me an expert by having one. But I do work a little bit with moms and other children and have worked with some of the classrooms at my son's preschool, etc., as well as taking a lot of additional coursework on breastfeeding and birth and delivery. So yeah. So I'll be sharing some of my own experiences as a mother, but like you watched in the syllabus, you guys will be able to share some of your friends or family's experience too with your extra credit videos. And the more that people contribute to the class and they get videos or they answer questions or share experiences, whether they've nannied before or babysat or had younger siblings, it really contributes to all of our learning because every child is different, every parent is different, and we can really learn the most when we have diversity from that. So on the syllabus, I gave you a little bit of information about the assignments coming up. The first one is the prenatal assignment where you'll be comparing two vitamin and or mineral supplements for either pregnant women or postnatal, like kind of a lactation vitamin. And there are assignments on PolyLearn or instructions on PolyLearn for that, as well as a little video guidance on that because you have to do some conversions with RDAs. And then I don't think I'll talk about these next topics for now. Maybe we'll talk more in class and some are reviewed on your syllabus. So I'm going to make my beautiful face go away and just go through this PowerPoint presentation. All right, so we'll get started if I can figure out how to not show my face. Okay. There we go. I did it. So, preconception nutrition. So we spend a whole lecture talking about preconception nutrition because it's so important. And if not followed correctly or established adequately, some women and some couples may not even be able to get pregnant. So both under and overnutrition in the preconception period can be vital for a healthy pregnancy. Also, preconception nutrition is important because eating habits and eating changes take a long time. And so you want to establish healthy habits way before you become pregnant, as well as establish adequate nutrient stores in your body of vitamins, minerals, fat, etc., to be able to have normal ovulatory cycles and nourish a baby should you get pregnant. So, some terms. Fertility. Fertility represents how many babies are born per 1,000 women, and fertility is an epidemiological statistical term. So, for example, they can look at fertility rates within different countries, and we actually will do that coming up. And you can kind of compare the health of one country to another by their fertility rates. This is a little bit misleading because there are many things that are components of fertility. So, for example, human fertility depends on nutrition. It depends on culture. Are you in a culture where a lot of babies are expected, or are you in a culture where maybe your career is more valuable? instinct, what is your own feeling about children? Do you even want to have them? Endocrinology, which has to do with hormones. Timing, are you going to wait till you're 40 to have a child, or are you going to start having children younger? Emotions, way of life, economics. So there are a lot of different things that go into fertility besides just the biological ability to bear children. There's another term called fecundancy, which represents the biological ability to bear children. But we're not going to talk about that in as much detail. Since I explained what fertility is, it would make sense that infertility is the absence of having children. And specifically, couples are considered infertile if they're not able to get pregnant after 1 year of unprotected sex, or 6 months if the woman is over 35 years old. Older women, unfortunately, have reduced risk of not being able to or increased risk of not being able to conceive a child. And when they do conceive a child, their pregnancies are higher risk, as well as their children are at higher risk for chromosomal birth-related abnormalities. Miscarriage is loss of a baby before the first 20 weeks of pregnancy. And actually, many babies are lost via reabsorption into the uterine wall within the first 6 weeks of actually becoming pregnant. So they estimate that about 30 to 50% of pregnancies are kind of self-terminated and just absorbed back into your body, at which point you probably wouldn't even have known you were pregnant. So miscarriages are really common. The later you get in terms of your pregnancy, the less common miscarriages are, but they're still pretty common. About 10% of pregnancies can end up in miscarriages, and there are different risk factors that increase or decrease that. So Healthy People 2020 nutrition-related objectives for the nation preconception. So this particular slide, I think all of these will be totally self-explanatory, but increasing the proportion of women who are at a healthy weight, reducing the proportion of women who have impaired fecundancy. So that's the word I just talked about. It was the biological inability to bear children. It can refer to men or women. Increase the proportion of women who do not drink, reduce iron deficiency, etc. So in these first few lectures, we're going to talk about ways that all of these goals can be achieved, and many of them can be achieved through healthy nutrition. Reproductive physiology. So I'm sure you guys have all heard of puberty. We're going to be talking about puberty in detail in this class, and sometimes it makes me feel like we're back in high school health class and I'm teaching sex education or something, but it is really important to understand the changes that adolescents go through, which prepare them to become parents. And we'll look at that from both perspectives. So puberty is your time of sexual maturation, when you're able to bear a child. It usually happens between age 9 and 16, but we'll get into that a little bit more. When women are born, they have all of the eggs that they're ever going to have, and sometimes the eggs are referred to as ova. So they're born with approximately 7 million ova, and through a woman's lifestyle, some of those ova are ovulated and travel through the menstrual cycle. Some of those ova might be fertilized and become children, but the majority of those ova will actually just be reabsorbed into her system, or unfortunately damaged by mostly environmental factors. So a woman has only a set amount of eggs. She can never produce any more. And the older she gets, the less eggs she has, and the health of those eggs declines as well, because they're actually old eggs. You know, if a woman has a child at 40, those eggs are 40 years old. They've gone through 40 years of whatever went into that woman's body or whatever chemicals she was exposed to. This is different for men because men are constantly producing new sperm. However, sperm numbers and vitality do also decline with age. So it is possible that younger men could potentially have healthier children or higher chance of fertilizing a woman with a younger sperm. It's really interesting. There's something called generational epigenetics, and it has to do with the eggs and the fact that women are born with all of the eggs that they will ever have. So if you are pregnant with a daughter, your daughter, as she develops in your womb, is developing her own 7 million eggs. So anything that your daughter is exposed to in utero will affect her eggs as they develop, and her eggs would go on to be your grandchildren. So potentially exposures that a female child has had in utero from her mother can go on to then affect that mother's grandchildren. And it just gets passed on generation and generation. So for example, if a mother is pregnant and she's had mercury fillings, like I think my mother probably had mercury in her teeth, that mercury could have seeped into, crossed the placenta, contaminated me, who knows, and affected my eggs, which I am a female. So you just never know what's going to happen. I had a son, so obviously he does not have any eggs, but you just never know if that mercury exposure potentially hurt me and my ability to have children. It's just really a new area of science that they're looking into. Okay, so I already mentioned that the time that you can bear children is usually around 9 to 15 years old. Menarche is otherwise known as your period or your first menstrual cycle. And there is a minimum body fat percent for starting menarche. So the body fat percent that is needed to start your period is 17%. The body fat percent that is generally needed to maintain regular cycles is 22%. So 17 and 22%. And those numbers came from a study by a woman named Frisch, and it was called Menstrual Cycles, Fatness as a Determinant of Minimum Weight for Height Necessary. And those studies were established a long time ago in the 1970s. So you do need a specific percent of body fat to be able to have your menstrual cycle. And really the cause of that is because body fat is a big regulator of hormones, and you need all the right hormones to be able to start menstruating and become pregnant. So menstruation problems affect both underweight and overweight women. If a woman is very low weight, doesn't have a lot of body fat, they're going to have less estrogen and other hormones such as less leptin. If they have higher fat, they may start their period earlier, and they may have higher levels of estrogen, which aren't necessarily a good thing. If they're normal weight and they lose even 10 to 15% of their weight, that could delay their period. And impaired fertility in underweight women usually takes the form of delayed time to conception or amenorrhea, which is missed periods. In underweight men, it can take the form of decreased sex drive, decreased sperm production, decreased prostate fluid, which can all lead to sperm motility and mobility issues. So, in adolescence, generally there is an increase in leptin, which is a hormone associated with body fat, and females gain excessive body fat during adolescence as they go through puberty. And with that increase in leptin, it can actually accelerate or activate a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, which we're going to talk about coming up. If there is not enough fatness, that hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, won't be activated till later, and this girl will not get her period until an older age, potentially. So in those who are overweight, it's recommended that they lose weight. In those who are underweight, it's recommended that they gain weight. According to a position paper by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, weight loss before pregnancy, and I'm literally quoting this here, can reduce the risk of poor fetal and maternal outcomes, such as preterm birth, gestational diabetes, gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, assisted delivery, and congenital abnormalities. So it's definitely important to be at a normal BMI when you're trying to get pregnant and throughout the pregnancy. All right, so some definitions related to the menstrual cycle. Follicle, we're going to talk about follicles a lot. Follicles are a cluster of cells or a cellular kind of aggregation, and it's found in the ovaries. The follicle will secrete hormones that influence the stage of the menstrual cycle. Each follicle can release an egg cell or an ovum. Sometimes we call the egg cells the ovum at ovulation during menstruation. So ovarian follicles are the basic unit of female reproductive biology. Each follicle contains a single oocyte, which is an immature ovum or egg cell, and an oocyte. Once a month, an ovary releases a mature egg known as the oocyte. So every month during the menstrual cycle, as you can kind of see in this drawing, you have primordial follicles, primary follicles, and then an oocyte. So multiple follicles, which do contain eggs, go through that maturation process, but only one of them is the most mature, and the others are just reabsorbed or kind of sloughed off into the uterine lining, and they disappear and you don't have those eggs anymore. But the one that matures becomes the egg that's released down at the bottom of this picture, and that's when ovulation happens. After the egg is released, well, there's a bit of tissue that had surrounded the egg. So after the egg is released, what's left of that tissue becomes the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum secretes additional hormones, progesterone in high amounts and some estrogen. And that causes the endometrium lining to grow. The endometrium is the lining of your uterus, which would serve as the site of implantation if the egg was fertilized. And so the menstrual cycle can be broken down into two periods: the follicular phase, where this follicle is maturing, and the luteal phase, where this corpus luteum is secreting hormones and then eventually degenerates. So I'm going to have about 6 slides on this, and they literally are all going to say the same thing. You're just going to hear it a few different ways, and you're going to hear a video, because this is probably the more complicated part of the entire class, like for the whole quarter. And so that's why I want to explain it completely. Okay, so these are pictures, the same picture I had on the last slide, and then another picture on the right-hand side. So the picture on the right-hand side is showing the hypothalamus as well as the anterior pituitary. These are both glands in the brain that are responsible for secreting hormones. GnRH you're going to see, but it's gonadotropin releasing hormone. FSH and LH are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And follicle stimulating hormone helps the follicle to grow and mature till it's going to secrete the oocyte. Luteinizing hormone actually causes the release of the egg, and that happens around 14 days into the menstrual cycle. And then lower in this picture, you can see kind of which hormones are spiking at which level of the menstrual cycle or which time period of the menstrual cycle. So estrogen is more predominant in the first half, where progesterone is more predominant in the second half. And then the very bottom is this lining of the uterus or the endometrium. And progesterone levels help build up the lining of the uterus or the endometrium. So I have a really good video that literally explains everything I just did, and we're going to watch it. I think it says oestrogen, and that's because it is a British version of the hormones. So let's go to this and watch.
Main players in the female reproductive cycle are the pituitary gland, the ovaries, and the uterus. Their activities are closely coordinated. Each month, one or other ovary releases a single egg, an event known as ovulation. It is brought about by a series of complex interactions between the pituitary gland, the ovaries, and the uterus. The pituitary gland is itself under the control of this small area of the brain known as the hypothalamus. A new menstrual cycle begins when the nerve cells of this center secrete a hormone called gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, GnRH, into the network of blood vessels which surrounds the pituitary gland. Stimulated by pulses of gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, cells in the pituitary gland secrete another hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. FSH travels in the bloodstream, reaching the ovaries. There it stimulates the formation and growth of an ovarian follicle in one or other ovary. The follicle consists of an egg, a number of surrounding cells which secrete estrogen hormones, and fluid. FSH helps the egg to mature and prepares it for release. As the follicle matures, the hypothalamus increases secretion of GnRH. This in turn stimulates the pituitary to secrete a second hormone which acts on the ovary. This is luteinizing hormone, or LH. Toward the middle of the cycle, there is a sudden peak in the blood level of LH. This acts as the trigger for ovulation. Within minutes of its release, the egg is guided by suction through the fringed opening of the outer end of the fallopian tube, starting it on a journey which will take 5 or 6 days as it passes down the tube and finally reaches the cavity of the uterus. Meanwhile, after the follicle ruptures, it is converted into this yellowish body known as the corpus luteum. Cells of the corpus luteum secrete the hormone progesterone, which brings about important changes in the lining of the uterus, preparing it for possible pregnancy. In fact, the lining of the uterus, known as the endometrium, undergoes changes in response to hormone levels during the cycle. In the first half of the cycle, known as the follicular phase, the developing follicle secretes increasing amounts of estrogen hormone, which encourages regeneration of the endometrium. After ovulation, there are important changes in the endometrium, aimed at making it suitable to receive a fertilized egg. These changes are brought about by a secretion of progesterone from the corpus luteum. The secretion of progesterone is maintained for several days, but if the egg is not fertilized in that time, the corpus luteum withers, and falling levels of progesterone and estrogen trigger the shedding of the uterine lining as the menstrual flow. The cycle then starts again. But if the egg is fertilized, no menstruation occurs, as the corpus luteum continues to function, secreting progesterone during the first 3 months of the pregnancy. Thereafter, numerous changes occur to support the developing embryo. Players in the
All right, so that was the video, and I think it's really good. And so now back to our slideshow. So this is just a diagram of the female reproductive system. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a sickness as well as had surgery. But these are the ovaries, or the ovary, one on each side. They are where the follicles are maintained, which have the eggs in them. Once a month, the most mature egg will be released. It's called the ovum or the oocyte. If there are sperm in the uterine tube or the fallopian tube, they will meet the oocyte. As the oocyte travels down, it will implant in the uterus. So you hope that no implantation happens in the uterine tube, but it's possible. You want the egg and the sperm to travel down together, or the egg to already be down in the uterus before the sperm meet it so that it can implant there. So this is a really good summary table looking at all of the different hormones and where they're secreted and what role that they play. So the very first hormone that is released is gonadotropin-releasing hormone. It's released from the hypothalamus, and it stimulates FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone to be produced by the anterior pituitary gland. Follicle stimulating hormone helps the follicle mature. It secretes estrogen, etc. Luteinizing hormone spikes at around 14 days and causes the rupture of that follicle. And then you have estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Progesterone is otherwise known as progestational, as it says on this graph. And so it prepares the uterus to support a fertilized egg if there is one there. An interesting note regarding estrogen, after menopause, the ovaries no longer secrete estrogen. And so fat in a woman's body is the primary organ that secretes estrogen. And so this is one theory why it's hard for women after menopause to lose weight, because their body needs still a supply of estrogen, but the fat cells are the only cells that can release it, or the primary cells that can release it. So their body holds on to the fat so that it can still supply itself with estrogen. Another interesting thing I'll say, the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, it stores glycogen and other nutrients, and so it can supply the growth of blood vessels and nourish kind of the fetus as it implants during the beginning of the pregnancy cycle. So there are 2 phases of the menstrual cycle, and you probably heard the video saying that. So this is kind of a review, but hopefully it will make it really easy for you to remember. I think of the phases as F and L, and if you look at them alphabetically, F is first in the alphabet, and F also stands for first, or has the same letters first, and L is last in the alphabet and shares a letter with last. So follicular phase is first, luteal phase is last. And the phases themselves actually describe what's happening. So the first phase, the follicular phase, is where this follicle is maturing. The luteal phase really stimulates, or the luteal phase focuses on the corpus luteum, this body that is now degrading and secreting hormones. So there is a rundown of what happens for you in the follicular phase. I usually would explain more about this, but I think that we've kind of heard it quite a few times. So that is what happens. And it begins with the hypothalamus secreting gonadotropin releasing hormone. What causes the hypothalamus to secrete gonadotropin releasing hormone? It's actually estrogen that can stimulate that. So if you didn't have enough estrogen, you wouldn't be able to stimulate that, and hence you probably wouldn't have your menstrual cycle. During the luteal phase, so this is the second phase of the menstrual cycle from day 14 to 28 approximately, there are high levels of luteinizing hormone, and that's because the follicle has ruptured. And after the follicle is ruptured, the leftover follicle becomes the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum will continue to secrete hormones. So CL stands for corpus luteum, and it will secrete some estrogen, not as much as in the first phase, but a lot of progesterone. And progesterone, remember, is progestational. So progesterone is the hormone that is primarily causing the endometrium lining to mature and thicken in case there is an egg that could be implanted. Estrogen is a little bit complicated because estrogen in the first half of the menstrual cycle, or the follicular phase, stimulates gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is what I just said. But in the second phase of the menstrual cycle, it inhibits gonadotropin releasing hormone. So if you had too much estrogen, it could throw off levels of the menstrual cycle, because usually it's a low level of estrogen in the second half, but if it was a very high level, it might be enough to stimulate gonadotropin releasing hormone in the second half. So estrogen plays 2 different roles with gonadotropin releasing hormone. In the first half, it stimulates it. In the second half, it inhibits it. As the corpus luteum matures, it degenerates if it's not fertilized, because if it's not fertilized, the hormone levels will start to drop, such as the levels of progesterone, and the lining of the uterus will shed. Some interesting things about this phase of the menstrual cycle. So the luteal phase, it promotes cravings and fat storage. And so if people are going to start a diet, or specifically women who have a luteal phase, they should actually wait till the beginning part of their menstrual cycle to start a diet, because there have been studies that have clinically proven that their cravings for foods, specifically carb foods, are higher during the second phase of the menstrual cycle, and their body is more likely to hold on to fat because the body thinks, I have an egg in circulation, I could get pregnant right now. So specifically, there are scientific evidence for cravings of chocolate as well as carbs. And so what happens is, in the second half of the menstrual cycle, the estrogen levels drop and there's a peak in progesterone. And this promotes fat storage by clearing the blood of triglycerides and storing it in fatty tissue. And so this clearance leads to the craving of fatty foods because the blood is actually low in circulating fats. So you could crave fatty foods, you could crave chocolate, you could crave sweet foods during the second half of your menstrual cycle, and it's literally due to your hormones. If implantation would occur, so if the sperm would be able to meet the egg, implantation into the uterus lining, this is important to know, generally takes 8 to 10 days. Okay, so this is a similar picture, just literally looking at everything that we have just said and reviewing it. Estrogen stimulates gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone acts on the anterior pituitary gland to secrete luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone encourages the growth of the follicle, at which time the most mature follicle will rupture when luteinizing hormone spikes, and that is also due to a high estrogen level. The egg will be released in ovulation, and the rest of the follicle will form the corpus luteum. In the second half of the cycle, estrogen will inhibit gonadotropin-releasing hormone, progesterone will as well. However, the very end of the second half of the menstrual cycle, progesterone and estrogen levels dip off a little bit, and then the cycle starts over again where estrogen acts to stimulate the menstrual cycle. So we don't have partners because this first lecture is online, but this would probably be a good brainstorming activity for yourself. And you definitely would like to know this information in case you happen to see it again. Okay, so fertility overview. Remember, we discussed that fertility had to do with biological, environmental, social, personal preference type factors. And so each month, a couple who is trying to have a baby has a 20 to 25% chance of conceiving. So 20 to 25% chance of conceiving. We're going to talk about infertility, and you don't need to know these statistics on infertility because they actually change every year. But some of the causes of infertility are stress, severe stress or chronic stress that causes a lot of inflammation and hormonal shifts, adverse nutrition, whether too much or not enough, infection, tubal or structural problems, maybe there's scarring or blocking of the tubes or damage to the uterus, chromosomal abnormalities, if babies usually inherit any extra chromosomes or missing chromosomes. Most of those babies do not go to term, although we know that babies with Down syndrome often go to term. Sexually transmitted diseases can damage the the female reproductive tract as well as the male reproductive tract. And then endometriosis is an inflammation of the endometrium, or that uterine lining, which makes it difficult for implantation to take place. Okay, these are some factors from a table in your book related to altered fertility in men and women. And so you see that weight loss is a factor for both. Not enough antioxidants are for both, not enough fat or too much alcohol, hormonal disorders, celiac disease, oxidative stress, infection, diabetes, cancer, etc. Females, you can see some of the conditions there. This does not mean that you won't have a baby if you're vegan or you're over 35 or you've ever had anorexia or you've ever been iron deficient or you're on a high fiber diet, which would generally be a healthy diet. It means there have been some studies that show an association. So don't want this to make you guys panic. But you probably don't want children right this minute anyways, so maybe these are good things. Males, we're going to talk about males too. I will not forget to include the males in this class, although it is maternal and child nutrition. They're just as important in the equation because without them, there would be no children, among other things and other great reasons why they're important. But we're going to talk about men in this lecture, in surprisingly breastfeeding lecture, in all of the childhood lectures, because children are both boys and girls. So the only thing I like to really point out about the men on this table that I don't like is the high intake of soy foods. There have been really mixed results with studies on soy, and we're going to look into that a little bit. But the verdict is not out on soy, so I would not list that as a for sure. Also, things I would add to the male category, excessive calorie intakes, very high carb diets, and excessive saturated or trans fat diets in animal studies have shown higher loss of embryos. So I would add that to the male category. How does undernutrition affect fertility? So it's really interesting. Chronic undernutrition, where people are constantly eating suboptimal levels of calories, maybe they need 2,000 calories a day and they're only able to eat 1,600. So chronic undernutrition actually barely affects fertility. And some of the countries with the highest rates of chronic nutrition still have really high fertility rates. But they also seem to have a lot higher infant mortality rates. So children are born, but children are often born smaller, sicker, and die quicker. Unfortunately, more children die in the first year of life, born to women who are undernourished. There are a lot of other factors that probably affect the fertility rates in these countries, such as access to birth control, cultural beliefs, etc. So I think it's a really complicated picture. Acute malnutrition. So acute malnutrition would be short term, but it could be very extreme. Like, for example, maybe for, a month, you only were able to eat 500 calories. So in these types of situations, you see more significant disruptions in fertility. And an example that the book likes to point out is famines. Like there was a Dutch famine. There was also European food shortages in the 17 to 1900s, which decreased birth rates. In World War II in Holland. There was not enough food, and they saw decreased birth rates throughout the country. Also, women with eating disorders often are not fertile and have decreased fertility rates. So that's a little bit about the under and over nutrition. Body fatness. So this is big, literally, but this is a big, complicated issue, and we're learning more and more about it all the time. You already heard me read the A&D position paper about losing weight for better infant and maternal outcomes. Why does all this happen? So it has to do with the hormones. Both high and low body weight are related to decreased fertility. So it has to do with estrogen, androgens, which are generally male sex hormones such as testosterone, and leptin. And leptin is a hormone usually associated with fat cells. And leptin is the hormone that tells us that we can stop eating, that we're full, that we're satisfied. But leptin can interact with gonadotropin releasing hormone. And so if there is too much fat, there will be a lot of leptin. The leptin will stimulate the hypothalamus to stimulate gonadotropin releasing hormone. However, the gonadotropin releasing hormone can be stimulated throughout the entire menstrual cycle, and that can cause interruptions in the menstrual cycle, irregular periods, lack of ovulation, etc., or maybe not being able to maintain the endometrium lining, etc. Because remember, we only want gonadotropin releasing hormone to be released in the beginning of the menstrual cycle, and it should be inhibited in the second half of the menstrual cycle because the estrogen and the progesterone are usually inhibiting it there. But if you have too much fat, leptin could be promoting it. If you do not have enough fat, the same thing can happen. So if you don't have enough fat, you're going to have decreased levels of leptin. You might not have enough leptin to help stimulate gonadotropin releasing hormone in the first place. I know it's estrogen that plays a role as well, but generally people who have lower body fat also have lower estrogen levels, or for women specifically. In men will have too much estrogen, which is generally a female-associated hormone, and too much leptin, and they won't have enough testosterone. So it's really interesting how body fat, too much or too little, can play a role. And so this chart I have is relationship between sperm concentration and BMI. So you can see sperm density on the left and then body mass on the bottom. And so as body mass increases, the sperm density decreases significantly. So yeah, so the slope of the line is generally downwards. So most obese men would not have as much sperm as a normal weight man. Some more studies that I've looked into about fertility. So they have done studies and they looked at timing of weight gain. So women who gained 15 kilograms, which is about 33 pounds, after age 17, which is when they should have been done with puberty already. You shouldn't really gain much after you finished maturing and gone through puberty. But if they gained 33 pounds after, they had lower fecundancy rates, remember, which is the biological ability to bear children. So they had about 72% chance of bearing children compared to those whose weight had been stable. If you looked at fecundancy ratios and just BMI class, overweight women, again, had 72% the fecundancy of normal weight. Obese women had 60% the fecundancy, and very obese had only 48% the fecundancy, or the biological ability. This is another interesting statistic. So among obese women, the infertility rate increases by 4% for each BMI unit. So say they go from a BMI of 30 to 31, their chances of having a baby just went down 4%. Specifically, central adiposity is associated with more infertility than pear-shaped or android. Sorry, not android, but pear-shaped, where there's more fat on the hips, because central adiposity will secrete too much in estrogen. For women who are using assisted reproductive technology like IV fertilization or hormone injections, the birth rate was 9% less for overweight women and 20% less for obese women, with miscarriage for overweight women 24% and miscarriage for obese women 36%. In males, obesity, like I said, leads to decreased androgens and too much estrogen. So huge hormonal role with obesity, and therefore promoting healthy weight for both men and women prior to pregnancy is going to greatly increase the chances that they're going to get pregnant and have a healthy pregnancy without risk of miscarriage, etc. Oh, that's kind of what I explained. So, overnutrition. So I've been kind of talking about this on the last slide. So overnutrition. So I already mentioned the decreased 4% per year with increased BMI. This is a really interesting graph. So it doesn't have units, but BMI is on the bottom, starting at a BMI 20 to 24, which would be normal. And then percent is on the left-hand side. So the green is likelihood of infertility, and you can see that the likelihood of infertility is pretty low up until like BMI 30, 34. And then as you get into these very obese BMIs, it goes really high. With a BMI 50, you have a 100% chance of infertility. The likelihood of getting pregnant is in black. So at a normal BMI, it's about 86%. BMI 25 to 29, which is just overweight, it drops to 78%. BMI in the obese range drops to 63, 52, 36, etc. And BMI 45, you have a very, very low chance of getting pregnant. And this is because of all of the hormonal disruptions. So, yeah. I already mentioned that adipose cells produce estrogens. Too much can impair the luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone secretion. Also, what happens with obesity is insulin resistance. So people, they secrete insulin, but their cells don't use the insulin appropriately to let glucose into the cells. Insulin will be secreted at high levels. It can actually bind to the ovaries and cause testosterone production, which a female doesn't want excessive testosterone production. That will not help her get pregnant. And then obesity is also associated with inflammation, low levels of inflammation, and so that damages the sperm and eggs as well. They've done studies on variations of estrogen, and slight variations in estrogen levels result in about 70% failure of the embryo to implant. So if there's too much estrogen, it could inhibit gonadotropin releasing hormone, luteal phase, and then luteal phase could be extended. So it's all complicated and very hormonal, but fat is a huge regulator in the menstrual cycle, more than you probably ever imagined. And that's why nutrition is so suited to play a role in improving fertility. Okay, so weight loss, I think I've mentioned this already, but if a normal weight person loses only 10 to 15% of their weight, they're going to have lower levels of estrogen, lower levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. If they don't have enough estrogen in the luteal phase, they're never going to stimulate gonadotropin releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone therefore won't stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete LH or FSH. They estimate that about 30% of impaired fertility is due to underweight. So, like I said, and according to the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the recommendation is to gain weight. But most women don't necessarily like this recommendation, and studies have found that almost all of them will seek a second opinion, which they'll probably get the same advice. I also talked a little bit about underweight in men. So this affects their sperm quality, motility, and sex drive. If men lose 25% of their normal weight, they might not have any sperm production. So weight is a big deal. Okay. This is a little bit of a review because we already talked about acute and chronic undernutrition. But if somebody is maybe purposely restricting their calories, it could lead to the hypothalamus not secreting gonadotropin releasing hormone and the menstrual cycle never starting. In eating disorders, they also have reductions in estrogen, which therefore decrease gonadotropin releasing hormone production and excretion, and the whole cycle gets messed up. If women with eating disorders, more specifically anorexia than bulimia, because most anorexics don't get pregnant, and so when they do, it's often quite surprising, but they tend to have much higher chances of miscarriage, preterm delivery, and low birth weight. A little bit more about fertility. So nutrient status, what helps, what doesn't. So studies have found that people who have low levels of antioxidants in their diet do tend to have lower fertility rates. However, supplementing antioxidants does not work. One of the most recent review articles, which takes a lot of other articles I found, looked at the benefits of antioxidant supplementation for pregnancy or birth, but they could not prove that supplementation was beneficial at all, and some studies have even shown that it could be harmful. You would think that antioxidants would be really important because there is a lot of oxidative stress that occurs to both the sperm and the eggs. And it is really important to have antioxidants. They just work better from foods than from supplements. Another study I looked at, it had 5,600 women, so it was a pretty strong study. And for the women who had the highest fruit intake, they had increased fertility 50%. Only 12% of the women in the highest fruit group 8% of the women in the highest fruit group had infertility versus 12% in the lowest fruit group. So that difference is a 50% difference in fertility rates. I will not ask you the details on that study. I just think it's interesting. The same study did not find any differences with vegetables. So that was also interesting. These are pictures of sperm that potentially have had oxidative damage or chromosomal abnormalities or definitely aren't normal. So you don't want your sperm to look like this or your partner's sperm. And so eating a diet rich in fruits, colorful foods, I think whole grains, nuts we're going to talk about can help protect them. Okay, so specifically for men, zinc is really important for all of the reproductive hormones in men and women, but very important in men. If a man is zinc deficient, he may not be producing enough testosterone. Zinc also reduces oxidative stress. It helps the sperm mature completely. And men who are infertile tend to have lower zinc levels. If they have low zinc levels and they're not infertile, they usually have abnormal sperm shapes or concentrations. However, the story with zinc is kind of the same. Supplements do not necessarily help. So this picture here, ignore it. But eating food that is high in zinc does help. So I have this disclaimer right here. Sources of zinc: oysters, another reason they're considered an aphrodisiac. They may increase your partner's sperm count or motility. Beef, crab, breakfast cereal that's fortified with zinc, lobster, pork chops, chickpeas, cashews, yogurt, and cheese are some of the sources of zinc. I have another article. Oh, here we go. That's what I just said. Alcohol. So alcohol, I think most men will know that alcohol is not good for reproductive performance. It does have a toxic effect on the testes. It reduces sperm motility. It can be associated with erectile dysfunction. However, these are at pretty high levels, but I don't recommend it as a fertility promoter. Yeah, so that's that. Heavy metals like mercury, cadmium, lead, those also reduce sperm production. And you could have abnormal shape, which we just saw in that picture, as well as abnormal motility. Maybe they can't swim very well. Saturated and trans fats. So there's been studies that high intakes of saturated and trans fats reduce sperm quality and reduce testicular function. This was an observational study because it's obviously not very ethical to perform a double-blind placebo-controlled study here if something might harm the sperm or the testicles, but reduce your intake of saturated and trans fats. And then, yeah, observational. Okay, I wanted to talk about one more thing on this slide that I don't have, but nuts. And I like to make the cheesy joke that nuts are good for your nuts for the men. There was a recent article that came out in the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology. And for men who ate nuts, it was mixed nuts. I think it included walnuts and almonds and some different things. They had 60 grams of nuts a day. They had 16% better sperm count. They had more sperm vitality, better motility, and improved morphology. And they think that the nuts protected the sperm against DNA damage. So, soy. This is a little bit of a controversial issue, and studies have not really been able to come to a huge consensus on it. Originally, we were worried about soy because in animal studies, specifically sheep, we did see reduced sperm count and reduced fertility rates in sheep. It's also chemically similar to estrogen, and it may bind to some of the estrogen receptors. So there's thought that it could work like estrogen, and we know that in overweight models, when there's too much estrogen, it can disrupt fertility. What do the studies say though? So 2007 review study said that soy did not help or hurt couples trying to conceive, but prior studies said that it had reduced female fertility. I have a study from February 2019, The Science of Soy. This is a nutrition magazine, and it says that soy has been associated with reduced sperm concentration, but not motility, and was not associated with fertility reduction. So even though there was less sperm, the fertility rates were normal, and that was only in men who were seeking reproductive assistance. Men who weren't seeking help for reproductive assistance had no effects to their sperm quality. So we really do think that soy is fine, even if it does cause reduced sperm count in men. It's not associated with reduced fertility. In women, there have been some studies that say it increases the menstrual cycle length, which for some women, that might be something to jump up and down for. You get your period less often. But if you're trying to conceive, that probably wouldn't be good. The amounts that were associated with that were 20 to 30 milligrams a day. And just for example, soy milk, a cup has 6.2. Soybeans, a half a cup, have 16. Miso has 57. So it really just depends what you eat or drink for your soy. But I definitely don't think it's harmful overall in humans, and soy has a lot of other health benefits. All right, just going to do a little bit more. So iron, we're going to talk about iron throughout this entire class. It's one of the most important minerals to the body. You can't conceive without it. You can't produce red blood cells, etc. Most prenatal vitamins do contain iron because women tend to be iron deficient at higher rates than men. And when you do get pregnant, the fetus as well as your growing body are going to have really high demands for iron. So, yeah, they did one study in women who used iron supplements, and they were 60% less likely to be infertile than those women who did not. I won't ask you that statistic, but just know that iron is important. Alcohol in women decreases estrogen, progesterone, and fertility. Some studies have shown 40%, other studies have shown no real effect. We know it's not good to drink and try to get pregnant because alcohol can cause DNA damage. It's a teratogen, etc. But it's unethical to do randomized controls trials where you would take pregnant women and give them alcohol and see what happens. So a lot of our data in nutrition and pregnancy, as well as childhood, is observational in nature. Lead, I already talked about. It disrupts everything, but it can decrease sperm production, testosterone. The heavy metals could damage the eggs permanently, etc. And caffeine is a little controversial. Some studies have found that it will reduce your chances of getting pregnant, especially if you drink like 3 cups or 2 strong cups a day. And other studies have shown no effect. From an anecdotal evidence perspective, I have heard of many women who have given up caffeine after trying to get pregnant for a long time. And then when they gave up caffeine, they actually got pregnant. So it may have some effect on fertility. Okay, so I think we're going to stop there for the day. I think this has been long enough for your first lecture, and we will continue this discussion on Monday, which is actually going to be the second week of class because you only have Wednesday the first week. And I really appreciate you listening. I hope you took good notes. You will see some of these things on your midterm. And yeah, that was kind of the most technical lecture. So if we can get through that, we can get through anything. All right, thanks. Bye.